Simone, very happy to see you back with us. Allow me to introduce you to the rest of the audience. So I'm really thrilled to see Simone come back, now not as a respondent to my thesis, but as a presenter of her, what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating talk. Simone is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo, the Faculty of Theology, and she's affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge, where she co-teaches the theology in the Anthropocene module. She also received her PhD from Faculty of Divinity at University of Cambridge. And her academic interests span philosophy of religion, French spiritualism, ecotheology, and more. Her first book, Effort and Grace, on the spiritual exercise of philosophy was out last year, and it tackles the importance of Simone Weil's concept of attention for critical theory and practice. She's also published widely on attention and environmental ethics, and currently working on a co-authored monograph addressing attention as a spiritual technology for the transformation of Earth, spell work for a damaged planet, magic and ecology. Speaking of magic and ecology, she also co-convened and co-founded a platform titled Magic and Ecology, which features podcasts, webinars, and artworks. And I really urge you to visit their website and to engage with their program. They always have fascinating talks and webinars. And I think on a personal note, I just wanted to mention how much I was thrilled to come across Simone's work. I used to think that I was the only person on this planet interested in the conflation of the vegetal and mystical. So it was a huge relief to find someone who has similar interest and indeed has engaged with those much more profoundly than I ever could. And Simone's talk today is titled Ecologies of Ecstasy, Mysticism, Agency, and the More Than Human. Questioning the everyday ethics and the art of living. Welcome, Simone.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And can you hear me all right? Is it good? Good.
Yes.
Yeah. Likewise, I mean, finding your work has been really exciting, and it's good to know that one is not alone. So I'm going to be talking, hopefully not for more than 20 minutes, so we have some time for questions about this book I'm writing at the moment, which is about the experience of being a medium for the world rather than grasping it at will. So it's an attempt to construct, using the exemplary case of religious ecstasy as figured in the history of Christian mysticism, and I'll get into the details of that in a bit. It's an attempt to construct an account of agency that borrows its weft from dependency rather than autonomy, and receptivity rather than effort and power over. So the background to this is, of course, the questioning that's going on right now of human privilege and the philosophies that have privileged the human. Yet our custom of defaulting to what Charlie Coleman, in a really wonderful study of abandonment, has called the self-possessed Enlightenment subject, reinforces the ideals that lie at the origins of the environmental crisis. So it's in this context that the book thinks with the concept of passiveness. So what's remarkable about ecstasy is not only the visions and miracles through which ecstasy has been theorized as something supernatural, something extraordinary. Rather, it's first of all a sense of self-loss in which what is experienced is a state of openness to the world. And what really interests me are kind of the practices that you engage in order to get into that state. So here, ecstasy loses its familiar meaning of an extreme or peak experience and invokes instead what the philosopher Jonathan Guarnieri, writing about similar states in Buddhist philosophy, calls ecotonality. So an attentiveness or attunement to the world. It's this ecotonal meaning of ecstasy that will be my main task to try and return to in what follows. And that was a really interesting book that came out a few years ago, Attention, Not Self by Guarnieri, which I highly recommend. It's a beautiful book. So in endeavoring to return to this ecotonal meaning of ecstasy, I find myself following the tracks of two sort of loosely connected but distinct movements. One is a line of continental philosophers, among them Michel Henry, Gilles Deleuze, Giorgio Agamben, and Isabel Stengers, who have all in different ways suggested that ecstasy and contemplation invite us to rethink our assumptions about what it means to exercise agency. That word exercise is chosen deliberately, and we'll come back to that. Well, hopefully it'll become clear why I chose that word. So in this movement, vitalism, or the argument that all life forms, not only humans, are the source of their own agency, is a key concern for all these thinkers, as it will be for me. But it's also been seen by them as a problem, insofar as vitalism historically has tended to equate agency with power. It's had a certain rhetoric of talking about what it means to have agency. So Deleuze, who's perhaps the focal point of this gathering of continental philosophers, argued that while life is indeed powerful, and anyone who knows Deleuze will know that he calls himself a vitalist very openly, he says that not all life forms exercise power directly over the environment. So if we take seriously that everything has agency, then we also need to rethink what we mean by agency, because it's exercised so differently by different life forms. So rather, at a cellular level still echoed among plants, evolution is the result of what he calls a passive synthesis, with change and adaptation occurring gradually as the organism responds to its environment, contracting it repeatedly. So this is an argument that Deleuze gets from a particularly kind of French tradition of evolutionary theory that is associated with Lamarck, but today has been received quite well with new studies on epigenesis. Deleuze calls this process of contraction contemplation, on analogy with the passive awareness aimed at by ancient Greek philosophers, and argues that this contemplation goes all the way down into organic life. So life is constantly contemplating. That's how it creates. So this loosely connected line of thinkers that are operating with this idea, with its provocative suggestion that ecstasy, that is a paradoxical effort that's neither really passive nor entirely active, and vitality converge on the deepest level. This loosely connected group meets in my work with feminist, eco-theological, and especially queer rereadings of mysticism, and their attempt to rethink the passivity or passiveness of the mystic, not only as a posture necessitated by oppression, but also as a source of wisdom and resilience in itself. And this is something that we touched on in the seminar earlier. So in particular, I'm interested in what these new accounts of mysticism have opened up, but not yet fully articulated in relation to the historical sources. So in my book, I focus on a specific genre of mystical texts. They are handbooks of spiritual direction. Anyone who's read Michel Foucault will recognize the genre. These are textbooks of for mystics, like how do you prepare yourself for ecstasy? Here are the steps. And I'm interested in a specific method of spiritual practice because that genre is really very broad. And this specific method is often identifiable by being referred to as short and simple. And those words, again, very important, and we'll be coming back to them. So short and simple methods were particularly popular during the early modern period. So around the Reformation, and very much to do with the kind of transformations of spirituality during that period. But it has plenty of precursors in the handbooks of the early church, as well as several later developments, kind of afterlife, especially among women mystics and mystics in marginalized groups. So what we find in these texts, and what really fascinates me, is not only accounts of passive agency, so through reports of channeling, mediumship, and prophecy, but an experimentation with passiveness as a spiritual technology, and not infrequently in comparison to non-human ways of life. And this is a really sort of amazing connection that I want to be thinking with today. So let me give you my favorite example, which is how I first sort of discovered this, this connection. It's in an anonymous 17th century manual, which is called a short and simple method of prayer or something like that. It's only maybe about 5 pages long. It was very popular. And we read here that the person who wishes to experience divine grace should become, quote, attentive like a plant. Originally written in French, so the word there is attentive, the same word. To become attentive like a plant. in order to, it goes on to say, to receive the sun of justice. So God is compared to the sun. There would follow ecstasy, the displacement or standing away of the self, and with it untold of delights, as the soul, likened to the plant, receives the grace from above. So upon returning to the self, the student is instructed to attempt to practice this plant-like mode of perception also in everyday life. So one of the things that's really important about this genre of spiritual exercise texts is that they don't insist on ecstasy being this kind of peak experience at all. It's something that you work up to it, and when it happens, it's out of the ordinary. But then you're supposed to have become so fundamentally transformed that your everyday life is now no longer everyday, but always extraordinary. Or rather, there's no difference between the ordinary and the extraordinary. But these are the basic features that recur in most descriptions of mystical prayer in this particular kind of literature, which was really very popular. They are typical of early modern manuals, but the essential pattern is found also in much earlier texts, such as the immensely popular 6th century Ladder of Divine Ascent by John Climacus, in which those who pray ceaselessly are said to become like trees and, quote, live in communion with all that is natural. So in the Christian mystical text that I grapple with here, the vegetal analogy is not always present. You're not always comparing the one who prays to a tree or a plant, but often it's replaced by comparisons that allude to other forms of perception chosen because they exhibit the same characteristics as vegetal attention. So what are these characteristics? Attentiveness, an ability to be open and receptive, passiveness. The one who prays is compared to a bee attending to flowers, that's Francis de Sales, or to the wind responding to the promptings of the spirit who exhaled it into existence. That's St. John of the Cross, really kind of an image that we don't really, that's not how we really think about the wind today, but he's saying that the surest sign that the person has really experienced ecstasy is that they are carefree like the wind. Other times, the comparison is to a nursing mother's loving gaze, held in rapt attention by their infant, and it's assumed forgetful of personal motives. Or more abstractly, two concepts such as passivity or repose, idleness and playfulness are also mentioned. So the variation in imagery is offset by this remarkable consistency in the accounts of the techniques of those who achieved the state, which the manuals refer to as attentiveness or interior quiet. From these manuals, there emerges an image of ecstasy as a way of knowing, to be sure, a kind of like rarefied intellection, but one that's closer rather than more removed from the body's spontaneous mode. So hence its popularity, for nothing is easier than following one's instincts. And this is why these methods are called simple, easy, and short. And indeed, they often are not very long as books. But hence, of course, also the suspicion and ruthless persecution of those who practiced it openly. So ecstatics were known to despise marriage and other church sacraments. This is particularly so, it kind of begins a big movement during the 15th century and then spills over into the 16th and 17th centuries. Some of them lived in communes or wandering groups at the margins of society, kind of openly defying society. Many practiced equality between the sexes and were less prudish than other people. And of course, this indicated to the authorities the existence of a method that would permit all sorts of licentiousness by justifying an abandonment of everything that made a human stand out from other creatures and be civilized. So of course, this is why it's a really important technology to at least investigate today. But what I'm doing now is adopting a framework of vital passiveness as my basis for rethinking agency while thinking with ecstasy and these techniques of ecstasy. And this is quite different to the common ways we have of thinking, not only about agency, but also about ecstasy. And I thought I would say a few words about that now before getting back to thinking more about plants as well. So our common way of referring to ecstasy has tended, as I mentioned at the beginning, to push ecstasy into the domain of the extraordinary. So Maslow's interpretation of ecstasy as a peak experience, which has become a really popular way of referring to ecstasy, is perhaps the best example of this. And then we have like psychological interpretations, older ones, which have emphasized the bizarre and sort of pathologized ecstasy. And there's quite a lot of that in contemporary approaches as well, even though there tend to be more of these sort of positive appreciations of the peak experience. And then we have the interesting case of philosophy, where Martin Heidegger argued that the basic character of a human being, so Dasein, was that they stand out, exist from the world into which they're thrown. So this is an idea of ecstasy as a common experience, something we all share. But it's also one that alienates us from our Terran home world. So it's this odd kind of way in which it does become something that is extraordinary. And it certainly doesn't kind of unite us with other life forms. Christian theology, by contrast, has taken a more positive view of ecstasy, especially where mysticism is concerned. And I've mentioned sort of one brief account of that, but there are problems with it. And if there's, there's another side of it as well. I can go more into that if there's a bit of time. But it has also put ecstasy to flight by defining it as a supernatural grace, taking pains to distinguish a superior spiritual rapture from an inferior carnal transport. So theologians have kind of endorsed ecstasy when it has been of an approved kind, and then disparaged it when it's seen to be dangerously kind of deviant. The displays of bodily frankness that often accompanied ecstasy suggested to the authorities that these passive modes of knowing taught by the manuals was a dangerous business, only to be practiced by religious under strict supervisions. Those who did so in groups were, for instance, often accused of witchcraft, but also sort of lone practitioners. One person I'm writing about, a really fascinating female figure in the early modern period called Jeanne Guyon, was accused of witchcraft because of the way she practiced mysticism. So ultimately, this emphasis on the extraordinary, whether interpreted positively or negatively, has created these kind of very difficult images of ecstasy that are difficult to square with what I was mentioning at the beginning, this like vital passivity. So where does it come from? Well, it goes back to ancient Greek thought, where we find that ecstasis, literally displacement, was used to describe both divinely inspired states of rapture and episodes of madness and mental alienation. And so it becomes mapped onto the same kind of dualisms. So on the one hand, you know, the philosopher's rapture is all right, but then the hysterical woman's rapture is not all right. But it also carried an additional meaning, ecstasis in Greek thought. So it could also mean physical kinesis to real contact with an object, or the way in which an organism reacts responsively as it adapts to a new environment. So in ancient Greek thought, the very nature of living things was understood as growth by displacement or ecstasy. And in Aristotle, we find this really interesting idea of ecstasy pointing to the path of organic and even moral development. Change is ecstatic. It's the realization of a nature, a faculty, as in thinking, contemplation, and learning. That's from, I'm citing a really interesting article by Kevin Corrigan on ecstasy in early pagan and Christian mystical writings, where he emphasizes this alternative view of ecstasy that we get in the ancient sources. And in the concept of physical kinesis by ecstasy, something distinct that is an ecology of ecstasy has persisted beneath the surface of Western philosophy. I'd argue that this is kind of what we see emerging in these manuals of spiritual direction, but confusingly presented, because they're also operating under a theological principle that imposes a strict hierarchy between, you know, sort of angels, humans, animals, and then plants at the bottom, right? So there is this kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on, which makes the text easy to overlook in our context, but I think all the more fruitful, because they sort of dramatize all the tensions and difficulties that go into thinking this way. So it's this sense also that I think resurfaces in the line of thinkers I was mentioning at the beginning. And it's answered today, of course, in the recent work we have demonstrating not only the sophisticated awareness of plants and other inanimate organisms, but their similarities with ecstatic modes of thinking. So Agamben alludes to this research when, in a remarkable essay on Deleuze's concept of life, Agamben goes in to investigate the meaning of the word vegetative, threpein in Greek. So Agamben discovers that one of its senses corresponds to the idea of letting be, and relates this back to the state of beatitude and bliss that the mystic enjoys when they have relinquished their will to power. So this is how he describes it. All nourishment, all letting be is blessed and rejoices in itself. So beatitudo is how he describes vegetative life. Agamben thus makes the provocative suggestion that we should rethink ecstasy not as a suspension of ordinary life, but as the form life takes on its own spontaneously. And elsewhere he calls the properly human life this kind of life, right? And of course, I think it's the phenomenologist and philosopher of plant life who's joining us today, and Michael Marder, who's put this best in his work on vegetal life, what he calls plant thinking. And he describes this very well in the dialogue with Luce Irigaray, especially in relation to spiritual exercises and widening perception. And I think I won't read you the whole section, but there's a lovely bit of reflection on this in the dialogue with Luce Irigaray. So I read you bits of it. Plants maximize their exposure to sunlight, which they welcome with their leaves. They attend to the sun with every part of their bodies proliferating in the direction of the celestial blaze. And then by contrast, we have lost the paradisiacal ability to attend to oneself and to others in absolute openness. If we wish to discover vegetal mindfulness in ourselves, we should look no further than our body's unconscious attention to the surroundings and so forth. It's a really beautiful passage, but anyway, I butchered it by just taking out 2 sentences. But for the sake of brevity and discussion, what interests me especially here in these descriptions of plant thinking is the way, of course, there's a comparison of the plant's radical openness to the sun when trying to understand what it means also for humans to be open and attentive. And this is, of course, the same comparison that we find in this text of spiritual direction, especially the one I mentioned at the beginning, anonymous manual that compares prayer to the attentiveness of a plant towards the sun. And for several years, I'd been fascinated by the way in which the literature of spiritual direction describes the procedures for mystical prayer, but I'd found very little material to help corroborate my hunch that the allusions to not only non-humanity, but to a specific form of non-human understanding, kind of modality here, this passive modality, was more than a metaphor, or rather that the metaphor is always more than just a kind of superficial comparison, right? Marder's work has been especially useful in sort of fleshing out this connection. And also in relation to his most recent work on Hildegard of Bingen, because it suggests that vegetal thinking extends to the very way of knowing in which mystics engaged. And as I began researching this particular spiritual technology and its ramifications in the epoch of the Anthropocene, I discovered that while much has been written about mystics' friendliness with animals, plants, and minerals, their extensive knowledge of natural history, their visions of the cosmos, there's actually very little connecting the techniques of mystics to the non-human life ways with which they so evidently allied themselves. And this is why Marder's work is so fruitful, because it's not just about looking at the themes, the sort of ecological themes that we find, but the ecological modes of perception that mystics practice. And that means looking at passages which do not necessarily have anything to do with the non-human world thematically. They may even be quite anti-ecological in hierarchical modes of thinking, but how they are sort of approaching the world, it can still be ecological. So the idea is that mystics celebrate non-human kin, even to a certain extent, are said to participate more intensely in non-human life, was taken for granted, but sort of what that participation entailed, how they got there, was less clear. So it's addressing this non-human understanding in terms of a spiritual technology that I'm trying to do here. So we have a missing link, and the task of reforging it is what I'm doing at the moment. So what I hope to show, and this is my wrap-up comment, is that ecstasy matters to ecology hugely, but not only because ecstatics write about non-human kin in striking and dramatic ways that resist the Enlightenment account of agency, but because, like the ecologies that sustain life, going back to the idea of vital passivity, vital passiveness, ecstasy is a form of attentiveness. And so mysticism is significant because it's a pragmatics that gives advice on how to cultivate attentiveness as habits, how, in other words, to practice those alternative accounts that we're considering here. So how we can get away from not only considering them to actually doing them. And so for this reason, what interests me is less what mystical texts say about this agency, and rather the way in which their spiritual technologies were used to deform human perception in ways that move toward vital passiveness. So the Ecologies of Ecstasy, which is in the title of my talk, alludes to this relationship between practices of attentiveness and species co-survival, right? No creature thrives without the attentiveness of other creatures. So taking ecology in its oldest and most literal sense as rules of the house, I suggest that if Terra is the house, the oikos of earthlings, practices of attentiveness are its house rules, its logoi, and those practices of attentiveness is what ecstasy reveals. I think that has probably pushed me over my time already, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simone. I guess we can wait for some questions to come in. And here's one actually already. Shall I read it out? So a comparison with music that might be contemporary, interestingly, the late John Coltrane. Before I actually read the whole thing, I was wondering if it's a question or a comment.
Mediumship.
Okay, so the question is whether you relate. Okay, I have to read the whole comment, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm looking at it too. Yeah, I love this idea. Yeah, I think the question is if I can relate an approach to music. Can there be an ecological music? I actually gave a talk a few years ago on music as attention, because I mean there really is no, if we try to define music or any art form substantially, you know, it has to be like this or like that, then you know, it's endless, and there is no definition that will actually pin music down, because anything can be music if it's listened to attentively, right? You know, and if it's not listened to attentively, then it's no longer music, it's just wallpaper or just noise or whatever. So I think absolutely there is an ecology of music, which is again the sort of practice of attention. I think that's how I would approach it anyway. But I love that because I'm thinking particularly of an Italian composer called Billone. I don't know if you've heard of him, Pierluigi Billone. He's really interesting. He works a lot with attention, and his instructions to his performers is often that it doesn't matter how long this takes, etc., but you have to be attentive when you play it, and how that changes the performance. Super fascinating. Okay.
First, Hildegard of Bingen herself was also a composer, so I think the notion of ecological music can be connected with her straight away. So actually, I'm going to read out the question because I think it might be helpful for the recording later on. So Michael Marder is wondering how you deal with an apparent contradiction between the search for interior quiet, reminiscent of the Eastern Orthodox practice of hesychasm, and ecstatic experiences that seem to negate both the interior and the quiet.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, so for those who don't know the technical terms, hesychasm is a prayer that leads to an inner state of silence. Yeah, so interior quiet is often misunderstood as the kind of as the ecstatic experience itself. I mean, the ecstatic experience is beyond words, but the interior quiet is what you need in order to receive, or rather to recognize grace. Grace is always there, but we don't always recognize it. So we create in ourselves a susceptibility or an openness to it. That's how the kind of effort works in these texts. But they're often accused of kind of manufacturing experiences of grace. So the interior and the quiet isn't the same as ecstasy, right? Ecstasy is the experience you have having prepared yourself through interior quiet. At least that's how I interpret the manuals. And I mean, dare I say it, from like my own experimentations with the techniques and so on, I think it's important to try these things out as well. But I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, because I think there is I mean, this goes back to the debates that you get, really fascinating to read in terms of what we've been talking about, especially earlier in the seminar. The theological debates were very much about, like, is this grace? Because if interior quiet is grace, then you are manufacturing it, right? And that's a real problem. But that's not how the practitioners saw it. They said that, well, no, these are descriptions on the state you have to be in order to be receptive. And then what happens is all sorts of wonderful things that actually return you to the body, right? And this is what also then became seen as very dangerous, because what happened was that return to the body, they realized that there is no morally right or wrong. Like, it doesn't matter if I'm naked or not, because that's not what God really cares about. And this was seen as something really quite obviously transgressive and potentially easy to kind of misuse. But I think that's why it's important for us, those technologies and what they lead to. But yeah, that's how I sort of think about that apparent contradiction. Yes, Pauline Oliveros. I know, really wonderful. My brother's a composer, which is why I know, and my husband is a musician. Otherwise, I would not know about this. So this is not my own reading, but I've been introduced to Pauline Oliveros, who I believe has these exercises on deep listening. That's really relevant to this kind of thinking. Yes, deep listening, exactly. And there's lots of really good stuff in music and also music therapy on these different practices.
So we are running out of time, but if we can take one more question, perhaps briefly, and I had a question, but I'll have to ask you later. So Matt is asking in the Q&A section, might we usefully conceive the mystical as a zone and ecstasy as the experience of engaging and glimpsing into that zone? For an adept practitioner, ecstasy might become more mundane than with the novice, but the mystical would be a constant available to either in principle. I have in mind Wittgenstein describing as mystical that which manifests but is beyond description. Would you like to take that?
Oh, wow, I have to think more about that. Sorry, that was a lot. I can't see it in front of me. Also, I'd like to see the.
It's in the Q&A section.
Q&A, not the chat. Oh, I see. Sorry. Okay.
At the bottom of the screen.
As a zone, and ecstasy is the experience of engaging. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know zone. I have to think about that. I mean, the mystical is the secret, right? So the unspeakable. I think actually ecstasy. I mean, technically, the mystical means a sort of hidden meaning which is not evident, right? So for an adept practitioner, ecstasy might become more mundane than with a novice. Yes, no, but this is really important. I think this is the key, right? So when you have gone through the exercises, you realize that actually it wasn't something supernatural. The pedestal is there for the non-practitioner. And I think this is why it's so important, not only that we write about mysticism, but that we actually try and do to write mystically. I mean, this is what Michael does a lot in his work. I mean, just to try for this not to just be a theme, because then we do the sort of thing of pedestaling it. And if we're thinking about ethics, environmental ethics, I mean, it can't be something that's unattainable or romanticized, you know? And Timothy Morton does this really well as well by showing how there's ecological isn't something you become, it's something you already are, and you have to sort of like, it's something you can do every day. So yeah, no, that's really important, makes a lot of sense.
Adrian Ivachev mentions that he loves the idea of a mystical as a zone, which is unsurprising given his previous talk. I'm afraid we have to stop here. I'm really sorry that we can't take Adrian's question, but in a totalitarian move, I'm afraid I have to end this session. And we were supposed to start the next one exactly now, but I suggest that we give a few minutes of break and we come back in a couple of minutes. But meanwhile, thank you so much, Simone, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much
for your
time and questions.